as part of the 21st Century Film Club, we're going to be reviewing films you may have missed because of the pandemic.
This film is The Courier from 2020 and it's on Netflix. What did you think of the film?
I liked it. I thought it was a really, really good watch. Quite gripping, very interesting. In fact, it was a genuinely true story as well. I was just like, crazy.
Oh yeah, I loved it. It wasn't like 10 out of 10 film, but I loved the story. I didn't really know the story itself, but I knew vaguely about the situation. But yeah, I didn't really know that individual story. But yeah, I loved it. I loved how they portrayed it. I loved how the main two characters were acted out, and yeah, I loved it so much.
I actually ended up loving it. I think I struggled for the first half of the film, and then I got really into it by the second half of the film. I think for the first half of the film, I was just a bit kind of like distracted by some of the CIA plots like that. I just felt like I knew it was a true story, but I kind of kept thinking about the realism of the film for some reason. And I think eventually into it, I just got lost in the story. I think part of that was Benedict Cumberbatch's performance really won me over. I think at first I was like, oh, not him again. But now I feel very apologetic for thinking that, because I actually think he was brilliant in it, especially the scene when there was Swan Lake, the ballet, and he was crying, and they really focused on his beautiful acting.
I think it was that scene that sort of was like, oh my god, these two, like, you sort of felt what they were going through. You felt the tension, like the anxieties, like they're risking their lives for this. I think they sort of knew as well that this might not work, and they sort of, the way they were watching it, like the tears coming down their faces, like, oh my god, you sort of felt their emotion. It was just so good.
Yeah, I agree. I really liked the film. I thought the acting was amazing, especially that scene. It's like just showing how all the stresses of everything they've been through, their only time to let it out is when there's a performance on, so they can justify why they're crying. And for me, that really embodied like the stress and the like self-containment that they have to be going through.
And speaking of self-containment, it's like scenes like that are really self-contained. It doesn't really, you didn't, even if you struggled with other bits of the plot, and some of it at the beginning I was like, what's going on here? You know, just kind of like the spy stuff, because I think I was just like, and then I finally like got what they were doing. I think it's because it kind of dropped you in quite into the operations that were going on.
There was no backstory in terms of like what they've been doing before, like Oleg's character when he went over, what he's been doing.
That's exactly. It was more about.
It was very much pick it up and go along.
Yeah. But I think eventually you do, and I think as soon as I realised, oh, this is all leading up to the Cuban Missile Crisis, then I was like, oh yeah. But that was probably a weakness and a strength. I think it's a strength in a way. They showed a different perspective to that story, but it's a story I've seen many times.
The Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yes, I think it's often in films as the background context of an early 60s piece where people are going through. I mean, you can only imagine how it was in people's lives. So even if it's a couple fighting or a romance film, the Cuban Missile Crisis going in the background, it has a lot of relevance, like urgency. There's lots of Ian McEwan has a book kind of about it, you know. So I've seen that before, but yeah. What did you do you think it's fair that we keep going over kind of the same stories again in our culture, like 1962?
See, I really liked this one because I thought it wasn't going over the same stories before. I feel like, obviously we've all heard about the Cuban Missile Crisis, we all know about it, but they didn't go into too much detail at the start about like the lead up to the Cold War, which I thought was good, even though, you know, it could have been confusing. And I had no idea that was a British. Obviously, I assumed there'd be British spies.
Yes.
And I know that there was, but I had no idea about this one-man story and how he went over and how he then went back to save that person's life. And then he spent like years locked up in a gulag and then came out. I just thought it was a really fresh take on it.
I would have kind of liked a bit more background, but I don't mind that we didn't go into too much background because you sort of get it throughout the film. You sort of get how tense that situation was between the Soviet Union and the United States at the time. You sort of got it from like when they were showing broadcast of like what you do if a nuclear bomb was coming, I guess. And I really liked how they did that. It sort of just brought home how tense that situation was and how real it was, I guess, because I guess it would have been like, terrifying.
I think for me, because we know how the Cold War panned out, sometimes I'm quite critical of the spying involved.
In what way?
In the way that I'm like, oh, they're just playing games against each other, you know, in the Cold War. I think sometimes it's really easy to have like as like a postmodern liberal, you have like that perspective of the Cold War as being like both sides are bad. You know, America's also bad, Russia's also bad. These two spies are playing games against each other. It's pathetic could be kind of a word you could say about the CIA. And I do think the film was, at first, it's kind of just like statecraft games are being played. And at first I was a bit like, no, I would never ever, for my country, sacrifice, you know, myself as a pawn for this type of ideological battle in the Cold War. But I think by the end of the film, I definitely was like, they did show there was actually, this is a moral Cold War going on as well, between like the oppression of, because I know capitalism's bad, and you can argue that there's lots of, do you know in the 1950s with McCarthy in America, like they were innocent America themselves in the Cold War. Not with the, no, lots of things not innocent. But I think when you see how truly bad the Russians were, and perhaps are still, you can understand why he would sacrifice that. And I think that was a great message for me with the whole film, was if you're ever a bit neutral about the Cold War, like I think a lot of people are nowadays.
I think you sort of get that with all of the army people, or the people who work for the CIA or the KGB. They were all sort of wary of what the situation was. They weren't sort of doing it for themselves. I think maybe a little bit, but everyone knew the part that they had to play in this, and it wasn't just. The one bit was at Langley, when I don't know his name, but the general guy, and the way they talk about Britain and how it's like, oh, they're just little guys, I guess, and like they don't really care like what we do, or like we control them. But yeah, the way the people of authority are portrayed, I think they sort of got a situation, and they were sort of good at it.
I think kind of see what you're saying, because obviously in hindsight we know that the Cold War didn't really amount to anything in terms of actual war. Obviously it was a battle of ideologies in the end, but I disagree. I think at the time people thought nuclear war was coming. Like, imagine if Russia now was like, oh, we're going to extend the bombing to England, you would probably go and be like, oh my gosh, okay, right, we need to stop this. If someone approached you and said, right, let's try and, like, will you go into Russia? It would be a debate in your mind, because if the threat was to your country, like, the people thought they were going to die, and like it was very real at the time. And even now, looking at it as a battle or war of ideologies, it was there was two evils, like you know, but like communism extremely and extreme capitalism. I like the complete opposite, and both of them, well, kind of, and both of them like have their major flaws. I just think it was, I quite liked the fact it was about the Cold War, because as you say, these days lots of people don't necessarily see it as... I
don't think anyone takes a side anymore with the Cold War, like they do other wars.
Yeah, I guess so. It's relevant today, I guess, obviously with what's going on between in Russia, but it's kind of mad how that film sort of played out, like, what, a year or less than a year before what's happening now, I guess. But yeah,
it's really interesting.
Yeah, no, I really agree with you there, Harry, about we need to put ourselves into the context of people in the early 1960s. I think you can see at the end of the film it ended with, you know, they got the presidential line between the Kremlin and the White House, which is at the end of every single film where there's a Cuban Missile Crisis. So in a way I was like, you do know that. However, that is a really important thing to be said at the end of the film, because since then, even though the Cold War continued, there was never that threat of nuclear war, because they know the leaders would never be that despotic. It's just because there's no communication between the actual leaders. That's one of the theories to why it got so close.
Definitely, it's one of the major factors.
Major factors. So I think, even though, so I think after Cuban Missile Crisis in the 80s, people were still afraid of nuclear war. However, that could have been more of a exaggerated fear than a real fear than in the early 1960s it was. But no, it's a difficult part of British history as well, this the spies. I think for me personally, I think it was just mirror images, the Langley CIA and then the KGB. I know they have different ethical procedures and there's different violence, but to me, the way a lot of films and media and just history books present it is, that's the American version, that's the Russian version of the same system, espionage.
It's kind of interesting, because like I've never really heard, or it's not really taught, I guess, in schools what the UK's part in that situation was, because I guess obviously we saw in the film they would have been on the side of the Americans, but there would have been, obviously, given how close the Soviet Union was to Germany at the time, or East Germany, Western Germany at the time. It's I kind of wish it was sort of taught in schools, or I guess pushed into our lives, like of Britain's role at that time, because it's obviously such a massive point in history.
I think Britain obviously are allies with the US.
Yes.
But I think the role of Britain, because we didn't have anywhere near the nuclear arsenal that both of these two superpowers did. So obviously that's why I like the film, because Britain was in it. But I think the role of Britain was fairly low in terms of the fact we couldn't retaliate nuclear-wise. But I think, as you say, I completely agree. It was interesting to see that we did do something, and British people were out there. Like, I sound really patriotic, but British people were out there, like, risking their lives and stuff. So it was a nice film, and the fact that it included like a new viewpoint on it from the Britain perspective, rather than just Russia and America fighting against each other.
Yeah, it did make me want to research about like how realistic like the UK was as a target to Russia or the Soviet Union at the time, like, because like would the UK have been like the first target? That's something I made me want to research. But,
I know, it's because it's like the reason it's a Cuban Missile Crisis because they're in America's territory with the nuclear warheads.
So it's the first time they could actually destroy America.
So it and usually it does focus so much on JFK because that's a really interesting story. It did remind me a lot of The Imitation Game with Stephen. I completely agree. I also think Benedict Cumberbatch was playing the exact same character. I think his acting obviously is sublime. He's an amazing actor, but especially in these last few years, he's definitely been playing the same characters over and over again, and that was my only criticism. And it's not a criticism of that film per se, because obviously he's great at doing that character, and I really connected to him, obviously a world-class actor. But I don't know, I feel like I'd quite like to see him doing something different. Yes.
He always plays the posh, older gentleman.
This is why at the end of the film, when you saw the face, not that you can tell someone's posh from their face, but from the house as well, which you can, I think, someone's house. I was like, is this character a businessman, or is it an upper class businessman, or is it an upper middle class businessman?
Back in the day, there was a lot of overlap. So in order to become a successful business person, a lot of people
I was
had
thinking
to come from
class and money. I was thinking as soon as we saw the London home, but at the beginning, I was like, is he too posh for this role? You know, like, is that one small criticism? But I think actually by the end of the film, I was like, this is historical. It's just, to me, I think it does show that, as you said, it was an old boys network type of thing going on. But for me, at first, I was just like, is he so posh? He's so posh.
Yeah, it kind of like, until they outlined the historical side of it, it was quite like, what's going on. I also thought that you're talking about the inside of his home. I thought the cinematography inside the house was really nice. The way, do you know that one scene? I'm sure everyone's gonna be talking about this scene in terms of cinematography, but when he was in his drinking room and his wife was in the sort of like brightly lit kitchen, and they had the scene with the two doors. I really liked that. I thought she was there, like, in her place in the kitchen. Obviously, it's where a woman should be back in the day. And he was like in the men's room, like the drinking room, with all his like nice dark furniture, and I just thought it was a really beautiful scene. I thought it was very well done. It shows the contrast between the two people, and then it like foreshadowed, like, obviously the bigger gap and the divide that was going to come between them. And I thought the cinematography for that film was really nice.
Yeah, I agree. I thought it was a beautiful shot. I agree with you. I think Benedict Cumberbatch, I think he plays this role so many times, and I feel like he's very good at it. But I feel like I wish he'd sort of branch out into it.
I agree. I think Britain was drab, Russia was drab, CIA Langley was drab. Everything was drab, you know, with filming.
Right.
You know, like darkly kind of shot, washed out, drab, sad. It was beautifully filmed, and I kind of think they were saying everyone in that period was like a victim, and not just of like the nuclear war, but also of the Cold War institutions, the spies and networking. And even in like London's still very much over like the Russian smog, you know, like the Russian Cold War. It's like everywhere. It's chilly, and I did love that. I did think it was for people at the time how they felt realistic, and for the whole world during the Cuban Missile Crisis realistic. It's like the whole world is at risk, you know, so everyone's under the same boat.
Shot it and directed it very well in terms of like capturing the mood of the people, I think.
I think Langley was it wasn't unattractively portrayed. I think it's I think that's why Rachel Brosnan's character, who was blonde,
blonde.
But she's Miriam Maisel in Mrs. Maisel, and I thought her character, if she was real or not, I thought she was like the good guy from the CIA, and you know, like they're a bunch of rotten apples. The Russians are a bunch of rotten apples, and then occasionally you have a good apple, you know, like coming through, and I think that was her character.
Really?
I felt like for the first maybe 45 minutes, maybe first half of that film, they sort of took it lightly. They didn't really. They were not taking that situation seriously.
Yeah.
They were very blasé about it, and then I don't think she comes across well in that first half of the film. It's only when the second half of the film.
That's probably I'd agree.
That's when she becomes the good character, I guess.
I thought she was always clearly going to be good, though.
Yeah. I just think they were just trying to show, rather than the like. Obviously, I see where you're coming from with the like rotten apple, good person thing. I just kind of think they were just trying to show the humanity in everyone.
Yes.
Like even the whole, for me, the whole theme about one of the themes about the film was just humanity in everyone. Like even one of the Russians, Oleg, who was like the spy thing, which like was a person and like really lovely, really nice. His family were patriotic Russians. They obviously probably supported the system because they didn't know he was a spy. They were lovely. The whole thing was showing that it's not one side or another. It's just humans, and I think her character showed that well.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think probably one of the best scenes was her acting with the wife, with Greville's wife. That was probably one of the strongest scenes in the film. I think before that I was always a bit critical of her acting. I kind of felt I just felt like she was a bit jovial. It was almost like, for some of the scenes it was like she was in a silly thriller, glamorous thriller, and like everyone else was like the period actors, and then she was in like some lovely, amazing, like high class octane, you know, like thriller going on. Because she was just a bit more but I get that she's American, she was a bit more kind of glamorous than everyone else. Yeah, she'd never
really seen much of the violence of it, and I think she was like...
She kind of stood out.
Yeah.
She kind of stood out.
I think she was like kind of that like sexy secretary sort of character at the start, but then as the film went on, it was...
I think it's just everyone else kind of blended into the drab, and then she was like, you know, into that. And including his wife, who was like, if there ever was kind of like a wallflower kind of character, who could kind of... Who just was just thinking she was getting cheated on, and like all this character. She, like, if you contrast the two, who kind of fits more of the austere setting. But it was... I think in the end I was probably proved wrong by her character, because she, A, shows her humanity, and B, I think it does show, as you were saying, it is about, did people take the Cold War seriously at certain bits, some of it, and I kind of think, yes they did, but I think some of the institutions just played recklessly, you know, like fast and loose, reckless.
Yes, I think it was very serious.
Yes,
but I agree that like, because there wasn't any violence, it was a lot of like moves and counter moves, and like trying to outdo each other. It was just a really strange situation from both of the like superpowers trying to navigate around each other in like a format they'd never really seen before. Because before it was just like wars, World War I, like World War II, and then now they were trying to avoid it.
I don't think they behave like the military,
no,
who take things very seriously, and I think that's kind of, they are now the military. So for them to kind of take it all as like, I have a career thing, how will I improve my career? How will we do this? There's like real life people involved. Also,
I guess you have to remember it's entertainment. They probably just need something as well to like try and get people on board and to like relate to the characters and find it, you know, entertaining and engaging. So obviously they've dramatised it a bit.
I agree. Like, I feel like it must have been a serious situation, and people would have taken it seriously at the time, because obviously, if you're getting adverts for like how to take shelter during nuclear bombing, I feel like that's obviously a serious situation.
I think for me it's seriousness and also like sociopathy, like they're just like they don't think, they have no empathy. They're not thinking about the consequences of their action, both the Americans and the Russians. So it is kind
Bold
of
statement.
cruelty, the cruelty and coldness of them is that they are taking it seriously, but they're taking it seriously for the wrong reasons. It's there for them, it's about power. Yeah.
I guess kind of that's the nature of the Cold War, though, in terms of like it was about power play rather than about.
It was just leaders trying to outdo each other, and the Russian leaders trying to show that they've got power over the Americans.
What